Hi everyone, my name is Izzy. If you've been following along with these lessons, then this is the first time you're seeing me, and I will be teaching the rest of the lessons in this module. So today we're going to use our knowledge of the nervous system and the brain to try and understand biological neural networks. So we already know that the way that the brain functions is through coordination and communication across different functional regions. And today what we're going to try and understand is how the regions are connected and why that matters. So our key questions are, what is a biological neural network, and how can we conceptualize and frame biological neural networks to help us better understand neurotech? So, in the broadest of terms, a neural network in the context of the brain is a series of connections between related neurons that make up the basis for behavior. A neural network has three types of components: input components, processing components, and output components. It's worth noting that the word components can be switched out for layers, which will make sense later when we talk about perceptrons. In the brain, neural networks work in parallel, which is so important, so important. This means that within each component, there are multiple neurons acting in the same way. This not only makes neural networks super efficient, but it also provides a certain security in the network in the way that if one neuron in one of the components dies, the network as a whole will still be able to function. This small diagram at the bottom of the screen is used to describe the ways that neural networks work. And they can get more complex, but here I just want you to see that in the way that they're connected, if one dies, then there are other neurons connected in the same way to make up for it. And that's not to say that neuron death doesn't affect a network in any way, because it does, as we see in neurodegenerative diseases. But it's just demonstrating the ways that parallel processing acts as a safety net. There have been many models to explain more in depth how neural networks really work, and there's still a lot of questions to answer. But we're going to go over two models right now. The first is the McCulloch-Pitts model of a neuron, and the next is the perceptron. So, like it sounds, the McCulloch-Pitts model of a neuron is not a network as a whole, but just one neuron. It was first theorized in 1943, and it defines a neuron as a computational unit that takes in information and outputs Boolean values. A Boolean value is just the fancy name for the result of a logical computation, namely true, false, or correspondingly 1 or 0. A neuron may receive an input, and depending on its role in the network and its threshold, it may output a 1 or a 0 to the next neuron, which will then act according to its role. In the case of a biological neuron, an output of 1 means that the neuron fired, and an output of 0 means that the neuron did not fire. This series of inputs and outputs of zeros and ones gives the network as a whole the ability to achieve any logical computation. So this example will help you understand more what that means. So we have three neurons in a circuit here. Neuron A is an excitatory input neuron. Neuron B is an inhibitory neuron. And neuron C is an excitatory output neuron with constitutive activity. So looking at this as a whole network, A is the input, B is the processing, maybe, and C is the output, okay? That's relatively intuitive. So A is an excitatory neuron, and that means that when it fires, it causes the next neuron to fire. B is inhibitory, which means that when it fires, it causes the next neuron to stop firing. And C is excitatory with constitutive activity. This means that at base state, C is continuously firing. C is constantly outputting a 1. So before there's any stimulation, A outputs 0, B outputs 0, and C outputs 1. So my question is, according to the McCulloch-Pitts model of a neuron, what will the output be from B and C when A is stimulated to threshold? So A receives a 1, and since A is excitatory, it's going to output a 1 and cause B to fire, which means that B will output a 1. B is inhibitory though, which means that it stops the next neuron from firing. So C will then output a 0, just like that. So just to review that again, A was stimulated to threshold, so it makes sense that it would fire. B is stimulated by A, so it fires too, but since B is inhibitory, it stops C from firing. And of course, this is super simplistic. And in a real biological neural network, there are thousands of neurons working in parallel. But this is just to demonstrate how the neuron can be displayed as a computational unit. So the perceptron, which is a theory of neural networks as a whole, basically it takes the idea of the McCulloch-Pitts neuron to a broader scale, and it shows the various ways these neurons are connected. The basic idea of the perceptron is that neurons in a neural network are arranged in layers, and multiple units are working in parallel in each layer. In other words, a perceptron is made up of layers of McCulloch-Pitts neurons. There's an input layer, hidden layers, and output layers. The input layer and output layer are pretty self-explanatory what they do. The hidden layers are where all of the processing happens. They're called hidden because it's hard to know exactly what happens there. The connections between each layers are complex and weighted. This means that some connections may be stronger than others, and that one neuron can connect to multiple other neurons. In this way, the perceptron more accurately represents a real biological neural network. Basically, it models differing synaptic strengths. So when a neuron in the hidden layer receives inputs, it takes the weighted sum of all of these inputs and uses that to produce an output. And that can be shown through the different thickness of the lines, I suppose. And so the perceptron model is a basis for most attempts at creating artificial intelligence using neural networks. It doesn't capture all of the complexity of biological neural networks, but it's the best simple explanation that we can give. And so, just to put it in perspective, while it does capture more complexities, it still does not capture every aspect of biological neural networks that make up all of our essential processes. A problem that many models have is representing varying levels of selectivity and invariance that are present in biological neural networks. By invariance, I mean that in order to correctly identify and interact with our surroundings, the brain must have some circuits that don't change. However, in order to correctly categorize our surroundings and adapt to changes, there may be a certain amount of specificity required. So think of it like this. If I say the word tree, the picture that pops into your head is probably similar to mine, not exactly the same, because trees have certain characteristics that are the same. In this way, certain aspects of what it is to be a tree can be represented by an invariant network, one that doesn't change. However, if I say palm tree, then the picture of tree changes. Certain characteristics that are possibilities for tree have been selected for. The reason you know the difference between palm tree and any old tree is due to the selectivity of the networks and their ability to adapt. So, we're going to run through a super quick example of a biological neural network that is similar to these theories of neural networks that we've talked about. And it is the visual system. We're going to go more in depth into the visual system later on, but the whole idea is that the input to the visual system is an image. And well, if you want to go to a smaller scale, it's photons, it's light. But we'll just consider an image right now. And the output may be recognition or classification. So it's theorized that the initial receptors in the visual cortex are selective for gross, non-specific features, such as lines or curves. The next layer is selective for specific features, such as edges. The next layer is maybe selective for texture, and eventually you get to what are called facial neurons that are selective for faces. And again, that's all kind of theory, but the idea is the layers get more and more specific until the aggregation of the signal activates a matching output. This is actually how facial recognition works in artificial intelligence. And an understanding of biological neural networks is essential to build upon when studying artificial intelligence and artificial neural networks, which is how this all ties into neurotech. So finally, we just have a little summary. So neural networks can be broken down into layers that are able to take in information, process it, and produce a usable output. Biological neural networks are used as models for artificial neural networks. And next, we will dive into the biology of neurons. All right, that's all. Thanks, guys.